I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Every once in a while, we report on interesting stories from outside the Washington metropolitan area. Some months back, we did interviews with Ukrainians fighting against the Russian invasion. In this episode, we go to central Louisiana, where the local utility company is trying out for size and money a new technology of carbon sequestration. They're going to take the exhaust coming out of their fossil fuel power plant and run it through a series of chemical processes that will extract the carbon and allow it to be buried deep in the ground. The technical aspects of the plan are known to work, but the technology is not commercially viable and requires government support. A lot of it. I talked to Bill Conway, an electricity lawyer who is normally a Montgomery County resident, but now works for CLeco Corporate Holdings, the holding corporation for the public utility, where he's putting together the nearly $1 billion carbon sequestration project called Diamond Vault, and trying to convince the federal government to fund it. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from local musician Eddie Boxer. The songs in this episode come from his 2019 album, My Choice, and is available on Spotify. You are listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta.
Black stripes on white, this prison garb is a zebra. I'm free, come along, just follow. Breathing fire, dragon's breath, red is the flower, relieves you from stress. Come along.
You are listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. In the news this week, Prince George's County and the District of Columbia have said that they are starting to enforce existing nighttime youth curfew laws. In Prince George's, the law applies to young people under 17 and on school nights goes from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. and on Friday and Saturday from midnight to 5 a.m. In D.C., curfew hours are 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. on school nights and midnight to 6 a.m. on Fridays and Saturdays. Both jurisdictions allow young people to be outside when accompanied by adults or for special circumstances. In D.C., the police can detain youth who violate the curfew and release them to family members or to the city's Family Services Department. Parents could be fined up to $500. In Prince George's County, police will detain youths and hold them in police stations until they are released to parents, guardians, or the county social services. Police will issue warnings to parents for the first offense, but can fine them between $50 and $250 for subsequent violations. County officials say that the curfew has been imposed for an initial period of 30 days. Police and local officials say they are responding to increase in crime and particularly of juveniles committing crimes, many during nighttime. The Washington Post reported that youth arrests in 2022 were up 12% in Washington, D.C., and 53% in Prince George's County compared with the previous year. DC Police Chief Robert Conti said, "If you see a 13 or a 14-year-old out at 2 o'clock in the morning, something is wrong with that picture." Around the country, about 400 local and state jurisdictions have juvenile curfew laws, according to the National Youth Rights Association. But other jurisdictions in the Washington metropolitan region, including Montgomery, Fairfax, Arlington, and Alexandria, do not have laws that allow youth curfews. And in an interview on this podcast in spring 2022, Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy said that his office and the Montgomery County Police Department took juvenile crime seriously and had worked to bring the problem under control even by late 2021. There is considerable opposition to the idea of youth curfews. The ACLU of Maryland and D.C. have opposed the measure, as have others. Prince George's County Executive Angela Alsobrooks' rhetoric about parents being responsible is also causing concerns. Parents argue that it is hard to compel a 16-year-old to stay at home if they want to be out. Even if they don't have access to vehicles, their friends usually do. There is also concern that curfews will increase violent confrontations between police and black and brown young people as the police try to impose the curfew. A 2015 paper from the Brookings Institution from economists Jennifer Doliak and Gillian Carr looked at the effect of juvenile curfew on gun violence in D.C. between 2006 and 2012. Comparing two periods with different curfew start times, 11 p.m. and 12 midnight, they found a 150% increase in gunshots in the 11 p.m. hour. There was no such comparable increase at the midnight hour. Given the heavily black and brown racial makeup of Prince George's County and Washington, D.C., the impact of the curfew is expected to fall along race lines and could very well mean more young people entering the pipeline to prisons. Lastly, there is concern that curfew enforcement will detract the police from the real task of crime fighting, to which the police say that crime has increased in part because young people are out and about at night and getting into trouble. Montgomery County's ride-on bus service initiated several changes to its schedule. Bus services make changes to routes and frequency periodically, but the manner in which how this was done through a perfunctory press release rather than with details of the actual changes is a lesson on how not to inform the public. Routes 5, 9, 10, 15, 16, 34, 43, 48, 55, 61, and 100 will see reduced service. But there was no direct mention of these routes in the press release. There are 21 routes listed as being adjusted, but unclear what adjustment there is going to be. There is always the question of who on earth reads press releases. Moreover, in suburban Montgomery County, bus ridership relative to total population is low and tends to be low-income, minority, immigrant, younger and older. In other words, politically less powerful groups. But it is a good question to ask whether ridership is low because the transit system fails to communicate in fulsome detail with those who could be potentially riding the bus. Ride-On should be putting out detailed route-by-route changes in mapping and frequency on its website and send out alerts reminding riders of the changes along those routes and working perhaps with phone apps to disseminate this information. After 5 years at the job, local education reporter Caitlin Peets is leaving Bethesda Beat. This is a big blow to local schools coverage. Peets has been a constant presence at school board meetings for several years, including through the pandemic years. Peets was a guest on this podcast 2 times, both with record-breaking audiences. We will miss her and wish her well in her new position at Education Week. Au revoir, Caitlin. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Bill Conway of CLeco Corporation of Louisiana.
I never thought I'd stand up tall. I never thought I'd climb that wall. I never thought I'd have it all. Everybody talking like I'm so small. Now what you gonna say to me about being somebody? I'll crush this adversity. I'm all about trying to be free. And I say, if I choose to be discouraged, I stumble and I fall. If I choose to be dissatisfied, I never have it all. And I can fly so high. It's my choice, and I should fly so high. It's my choice.
Bill Conway, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you, Sunil.
What is the Diamond Vault project? Can you describe it?
Sure. Project Diamond Vault is a project to capture the CO2 emissions of our Madison 3 electric generation unit, 600 megawatt unit that burns petroleum coke, 70%, coal, 30%. Diamond Vault would capture 95% of the CO2 emissions of Madison 3, compress that CO2 and inject it into geological formations directly below our plant for permanent storage.
In the past, most carbon sequestration projects have been financed, in a sense, by enhanced oil recovery.
Yes.
But this is not one of those.
This is not one of those. This is strictly storage.
What is the technology involved? What technologies are you looking at? You're in the engineering design phase right now. Right?
Sure. There's various technologies out there, but the one that is most well known and tested, albeit not at the scale we're doing it, is uses an amine solvent. So the simplest way to understand this is the flue gas, the exhaust from our power operations, comes into a large vessel, and at the top of that vessel, there's a mist of amine solvent that drops down through that vessel, just a big column, and the flue gas goes up. And as that mist drops down, it grabs the CO2, chemically binds to the amine solvent. The amine solvent is collected at the bottom of this vessel. The amine solvent goes into another vessel, which is where heat is used to make that give up its CO2 that was chemically bound. The CO2 is then gathered, it's compressed to very high pressure, like 1,800 pounds per square inch, and then it's simply piped into a well that goes down several thousand feet. And the CO2 will be in what's called critical phase. So it meaning it's still a gas, but it behaves like a liquid. It's quite heavy, quite dense. And it will go down into these sand formations, and it's all salt water, saline aquifers. And it will bind with the surrounding rock. A certain amount of it will bind to the surrounding rock, and the rest of it will simply stay there, sealed off.
How do you seal them off? I'm just curious. How do you seal off gas like that?
It's like this is sort of conventional oil and gas operations, which typically operate under great pressure. You maintain, a sealed connection. You've got a pipe going down to the ground. It is cemented in place over thousands of feet. So there's no gas that's going to come up through there other than through your pipe. And you're continuously, we will, for Madison 3 and Project Diamond Vault, we will do this for 30 years. And then at the end of that time, that pipe is sealed off with a large column. It's filled up with concrete, and that does it. And that's sort of conventional operations from the oil and gas area. This is something that's well known. We've got decades of experience in this country injecting CO2 into the ground, principally to create pressure to cause oil to come up. But as a result of that, the way that CO2 behaves underneath the ground is well understood. And this part of it is not technically, it's not technically very complicated.
Sure. But, displacement is one thing, which is enhanced oil recovery, right? You're displacing one for the other. So
Yep.
in terms of volume, you're maintaining some sort of volume. But, if you just are adding volume to, at some point, you're going to fill up some aquifers, you're going to fill up the space, and then you have to, shut that hole down and build a new hole, right?
Yes, absolutely. And honestly, as part of the planning for this project, we have been doing through our contractor Battelle intensive modeling of the geology, of how it behaves, of the speed with which CO2 will move through formations. We're blessed. We actually have 3 different storage strata beneath us that are suitable for holding CO2, because you also need to have a dense caprock seal above it.
Right.
And we've got that. All of this you can determine through a variety of data sources, but a lot of it's seismic data that has been done in oil and gas exploration. Ultimately, this has to be permitted by either the EPA, or there's the process of Louisiana taking on what we call it primacy for regulating this.
Why is the Gulf Coast area geologically suitable to this kind of thing?
Mostly when you're looking to store CO2, you're looking at saline aquifers. So saline, meaning they're salty, so you're well below any drinking water storage areas, under the ground storage aquifers. And these saline aquifers tend to be essentially sand that was left by ancient riverbeds. And so Louisiana probably has the best geology in the whole country for these purposes. And the reason is because ancient deltas of the Mississippi River were very large, very broad, and went north way into, well, it kind of drops off just north of us. But so basically in Louisiana and then in Texas, at least as I understand it, you have these pockets of sand that are filled with salt water. And up where we are, they tend to be started, call it, say, 5,000 feet. It sort of descends the further towards the Gulf Coast you go, and it goes out underneath the ocean. So there is talk also about storing CO2 offshore in these saline aquifers under the seabed. Okay.
All right. The other sort of interesting part of the technology, I thought, was the energy use involved. You're obviously heating in the second container you talked about, and then you're pressurizing. What is the amount of energy used, and how do you deal with that?
It's shocking how much energy it takes to take that CO2 out of that waste stream. It's roughly speaking, it's a third of your net production of energy. So in other words, here's Madison 3 generates 600 megawatts. 200 of those megawatts are going to have to be used to capture the CO2. And then you noted compression. Compression is quite expensive, and to compress it into a form where it can be injected downhole into geology. So there is quite an energy penalty to doing this, and it's just the way the physics works. But it does make it, that makes the financing hard.
Can you talk about why CLeco is doing this?
There's no requirement for us to be doing this project at all. So where does it come from? It comes from our owners. And we're not publicly traded. We're privately held by 3, roughly speaking, private equity concerns. And our owners, and let me step back. Global capital as a whole, I believe, and I think the evidence is strong, has decided, regardless of what governments do, global capital has decided global climate change is a big problem. So bring it back to my company. Our board has made it clear to us that we have to do something about this, about our plant. And something I left out is our Madison 3 unit is the single biggest emitter of CO2 within the electric generation sector in Louisiana, at, depending upon what its capacity factor is, how much the plant runs, call it 3.5 to 4 million tons of CO2 per year. That's a lot. And so our board has made it clear to us that we need to do something about that. And closing the plant down would be economically catastrophic to both our customers and our owners. And so after an exhaustive analysis, we concluded, as massive as the project is, because this is a $900 million to $1 billion plant that we're putting on the back of an existing power plant, nevertheless, that CCS is the best solution. And so that's what we're doing. We're well down the road in terms of our design work.
Do you think then that the realization in private equity that this is a global problem, the realization is really that we have to push the government to do something about it?
So I think there's a consensus going towards action, particularly if the action is perceived as a manageable transition. And we've talked about government's support. I will tell you that in this area, the name of the game is the 45Q tax credit. Right under current law, it provides for a pure storage credit of $50 per ton captured and sequestered. At $50 a ton, it's a very difficult proposition.
How does $50 end up in terms of the break even that you're looking for? What is the sweet spot?
$50 a ton credit, that's a tax credit. So that means literally it's not a deduction. You net that against taxes you owe. And right now, under existing law, many companies, ourselves included, simply don't have the tax capacity to utilize that credit. And not only that, in the case of utilities, there's complicated rules of how you can't take that credit immediately. You have to normalize.
So do you want a market for that? Is that what you're looking for?
Yes. So under existing law, we need what's called tax equity, meaning a passive investor who comes in, has no control over the project whatsoever, but they invest their capital as an equity owner in the project, and they are paid mostly in terms of the value of the tax credit. Those are allocated, as well as accelerated depreciation, as well as any cash generated, allocated to them for a period of time until they make a stated return, and then the whole equity ownership structure flips and they kind of go away. That's what we call tax equity. That is the world, but that is a hard world to live in, because tax equity, think of it more like debt. So this is not investment where a tax equity investor will take any risk. The Inflation Adjustment Act would do a couple of things. It would up the $50 per ton tax credit to $85 per ton. And it would also make that credit direct pay for 5 years. What that would mean is that we, CLeco, for example, don't have to have tax capacity to use that credit. If we don't have the tax capacity, the Treasury will simply write us a check for that amount. That is very powerful. Not only that lasts for 5 years, then for 7 years thereafter, we don't have to have a tax equity investor who takes an equity interest. We can simply sell those credits. That's new. Those are tools that take what was very difficult at $50 a ton to something that's very doable at $85 a ton. And it's interesting because at $50 a ton, we've been at this effort for almost 2 years now and know more and more about the market, other players, what other people are doing. And it's pretty much the same story throughout, which is everybody's like, At $50 a ton, you're poised. You're working very hard to make this finely built watch that balances risk reward, but it's really tough. And maybe you get there, but maybe you don't. At $85 a ton, it becomes very doable. So we're very excited about that.
But the tax credit is only US based. You're asking for a 70% increase. The bulk of increase in CO2 production is outside the United States. Do you see the technology becoming cheap enough, right, at some point where this becomes viable without government support and therefore adoptable around the world rather than just in the United States?
Hard for me to say because there are other technologies coming, the transition to a hydrogen economy. But, even that, for example, there is a scenario that says, there's different flavors of hydrogen. Green hydrogen, which is through, created through electrolysis of water, very, very expensive because there's a huge energy penalty. But then there's blue hydrogen where you're reforming natural gas and guess what? Storing the CO2 underground. That could be a long-term solution. You would like to see a situation where ultimately, intuitively, you get away from burning things.
You're going to add $1 billion to the tail end of a solid fuel plant at Madison, right? I mean, there's the option also of taking the $1 billion and getting a new plant and closing down Madison.
We did look at that and we simply could not make it work. We're the most expensive utility in Louisiana at the moment. We don't have the ability to put, really any rate increase or any appreciable rate increase on the back of our customers. And in the case of Madison 3, there's other collateral aspects. Like, what might that be? Let me give you an example. Madison 3 accounts for 50% of the tonnage shipped on the Red River between coal, petroleum coke, and limestone, which is used in controlled air emissions. That's 50% of the traffic on the Red River. Red River needs a lot of dredging. Dredging funds are allocated by the federal government based on tonnage transported on the river. If Madison 3 goes away, in the absence of a drastically different allocation formula, we just killed all navigation on the Red River to the harm of many more people than just our customers.
What is the cost of a 600 megawatt plant these days?
Somewhere between 900 and $1 billion.
So it is exactly that cost.
Oh,
so
yeah. It's something in that range. By the way, there's other benefits to developing this site because one thing we've realized is that we have a lot of geology, very good geology that can store more than the emissions of our Madison 3 unit. And we have also become aware that the Haynesville Shale, which is a major natural gas production area to the northwest of us, has a big CO2 problem. CO2, natural gas comes out of the ground up there. It varies depending upon where you are in the Haynesville Shale, but basically on average and in the center of the Haynesville Shale area, natural gas comes out of the ground with a 5 to 7% CO2 content. And that CO2 has to be taken out as well as typically hydrogen sulfide. And it's already taken out because you cannot put, for chemical reasons, you cannot put natural gas with anything greater than, say, a 2% or even less content into a pipe. So where's that CO2 go right now? It's vented to the atmosphere, and it's a lot. And we've already had pipelines and producers from that area contact us and say, hey, gosh, from what we can tell, your geology down there at Project Diamond Vault looks pretty darn good. Can we talk about what would it take to get a pipeline that would pick up CO2, gather CO2 from large portions of the Haynesville Shale and send it down to Diamond Vault.
So you take Madison 3, and then you have 600 megawatts. 200 of those goes to your heating and compression use, and so you're already diminishing the output from the plant.
It's sort of do I wish it was a small energy penalty? You bet I do, but it's sort of like you don't get to dictate the laws of physics. So either you're going to do that, or you're not going to you're not going to be able to do it at all. And
right. So just for comparison purposes, so if you have, instead of 600 megawatt, you'll have a 400 megawatt plant in production. Yep. Right. So a 400 megawatt plant is a new one. Right. Yep. Is going to cost you $700 million instead of $1 billion. So you're spending $1 billion for the carbon project. You could have a new plant producing 400 megawatts for 700.
So recognize, though, we have an existing base of investment, and we would have to write all of that off. That is a very big economic hit. So that presents us with a very difficult choice, because yes, and a new plant, gas combined cycle, cheaper, less CO2. But what are you doing with your existing investment? Just going to write it off? I mean, sometimes.
Well, I mean, there's a law there's tax law available to take care of write-offs. I mean, you already have.
Well, we would be within our rights to, depending upon the circumstances, recover that from our ratepayers, but that we consider that to be not a non-starter. Also, regulatory questions whether we could ever do that.
That's right.
One thing you should consider is there's a tremendous economic benefit from this amount of investment into the local economy. So it has follow-on multiplier effects, very, very large ones. In addition, there's something else to think about, which is, even with the energy penalty we're talking about at Madison 3, what we wind up with is 400 megawatts of baseload clean energy. Now you say, well, Bill, you said 95% reduction. What about the last 5%? We can address that conceivably through substituting biomass for a portion of the fuel. But for all practical purposes, we now have baseload clean energy to sell. And as it turns out, there is probably a great demand for that clean energy. One other thing that is seriously being pursued, and particularly after the Inflation Reduction Act will make it even more viable, is something called direct air capture, or DACs. And direct air capture, all direct air capture is the same thing we're doing, only instead of taking flue gas with a high CO2 concentration, you're just taking CO2 out of the air. Right. But essentially, it's just a chemical plant that's taking CO2 out of the air. It has very large energy requirements, but in addition, it has to use clean energy for those requirements, because if they don't, it's just, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? And you have to have storage. So one of the things that is attractive about Diamond Vault is we will be providing a 24/7 clean energy solution with storage on site. So we see it, and the value of the power for those purposes will be at a premium over, let's say, market prices of power. So we've been in talks with one company in particular about the siting of a DAC facility at Madison 3 as part of sort of an extension of Diamond Vault. And so that's something. It's a good use of the power. In a sense, what you're doing there is you're taking that relatively expensive power off the back of our ratepayers and matching the asset with the right customer who values that premium. So that's another part of our thinking as to how this really begins to make sense. And by the way, some of your listeners may say, well, geez, why do you need to do that? Why don't you just take solar power? You'd have to, because that's, call it 8 hours a day. You got to multiply that by 3 and then just trade around that so that it's, attributable solar power. Turns out to be a lot easier said than done, so that the folks who are proceeding with direct air capture have said to us, we really prefer just a 24/7 source that's there. We know it's going to be there.
Bill Conway, thank you for taking the time to come on I Hate Politics. Good luck in the Diamond Vault project.
Thank you, Sunil.
I'm just wasting my time. It's been 4 months since you stole my heart away. It's been 3 weeks since you left and walked away. It's been 2 days since I gave up now. All I got is one lousy photo. One lousy photo. I don't know that. I don't know that I can really move on.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with electricity lawyer Bill Conway? Carbon sequestration uses an old technology pumping CO2 down into a well to push oil and gas up to the surface and applies it to storing carbon in the Earth's surface. While the technology is established, the commercial use of it outside of oil and gas production is new. To make it work, it needs the government. In this case, the federal government, to create incentives and perhaps even a market. Much like what happened for solar panels and electric vehicles, carbon sequestration to work needs tax credits. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the sequestered carbon received nearly $50 a ton in tax credits. But to really make it work, Bill Conway argues, the incentive has to be greater. At $85 a ton, a 70% increase. And it won't be entirely a tax credit alone. For the first 5 years, it needs to be direct financial support. And there needs to be a law to create a tradable market in the credits. Tax credits and markets in tax credits are a common way in which modern governments incentivize the private sector to make investments in technology, especially public goods technology, that are commercially not viable. In the case of carbon sequestration, according to Bill Conway, it is unclear whether this technology could ever be fully viable without government support, and therefore useful globally. The greatest rates of increase in carbon emission does not happen in advanced industrial societies, but where governments are not capable of supporting tax credit schemes and building rules that will create an investment market in those tax credits. Moreover, Conway also points out that carbon sequestration does look like a stopgap technology waiting for bigger breakthroughs in fuel technology, including hydrogen. Given how far away green hydrogen might be, the stopgap may in fact be necessary. If anything, Louisiana's Diamond Vault project raises a question I like to ask a lot. What is harder than rocket science? The answer? Paying for rocket science. Paying for a project like Diamond Vault or public goods is quite possibly one of the hardest things that we do as a society together.
Hear what I say.
that's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from local musician Eddie Boxer. The songs for this episode come from his 2019 album My Choice and is available on Spotify. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the show as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home and sometimes far away. See you next time.
Cross my heart, hope to die. Nothing that I say to you could ever be a lie. If everybody just knew what I knew, they would all know what's so special about you. Cross my heart, hope to die. Nothing that I say to you could ever be a lie. Feet on the ground, but you rise to the sky. Everybody's wrong now, let me tell you why. Oh, you're beautiful. You're beautiful. Hear what I say, 'cause I know everything. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. Forget what they say, 'cause they don't know a thing. Cross my heart, hope to die. Nothing that I say to you could ever be a lie. If everybody just knew what I knew, they would all know what's so special about